What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 5 of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, an episode called In the Name of the Mother. The episode was directed by Owen Harris and was written by Hiram Martinez and Ty McKell, as well as series co-creator Ira Parker. And after the incredibly positive reception of episode 4 of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, this episode had a very tough act to follow. I read somewhere that on platforms like IMDb, episode 4 was getting ratings that would set it alongside some of the most popular and beloved episodes of Game of Thrones. And my verdict on episode 5 would be everything that took place during the tournament, which more or less came directly from the source material, was fan-fucking-tastic. It was some of the most ruthless and gruesome medieval combat that I've ever seen on the big screen or the small screen. But everything from Duncan the Tall's Flashback basically came across like fan fiction, well-intentioned fan fiction, but if you ever want to see a very clear illustration of how George R. R. Martin's writing is superior to most writers in the world of television, but the tone and the style and the approach of their writing oftentimes is in direct contrast to the tone and the style of George R. R. Martin. And I should also add that all spoilers are fair game. If you're watching a video that's doing a breakdown of episode 5 of a given show, then clearly you are ready for the water cooler conversation where it's like, oh my god, wasn't it fucking crazy when this happened? Wasn't it crazy how that episode ended? So if you've not yet seen this show and you've been hearing a lot about it, read the book, or read the novella, which comes from the novella is called The Hedge Knight, comes from A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. The show is fantastic and is well worth your time, but I would recommend that everybody read the novella The Hedge Knight first because, to be honest, it's better. But let's get back to the episode itself. We're going to save the best for last when it comes to the events of the Trial of Seven. Let's start with some of my criticisms, which come from the flashback involving the childhood friend, Rafe, where the writers of the show were basically coming up with a lot of their own gobbledygook. And to be fair, Rafe is a real character from the source material, but Rafe is mentioned very briefly alongside Ferret and Pudding because way back in the day, long before Sir Duncan the Tall hooked up with Sir Arlen of Pennytree, they found a decapitated head and ran around Flea Bottom, terrorizing all the girls until basically the flesh rotted off the head and it just turned into a skull. And that precious, innocent little incident ends with them throwing the head into a pot somewhere. Long story short, if they had chosen to include that anecdote in the show, more power to them. But where I started to push back was when Rafe said, go out there and get a family.
You want a family? Go out there. Get a family.
And when you're exploring the notion of a found family in a very sentimental fashion, that's the kind of crap you can find in any show, but this is the Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and all the dialogue should feel like dialogue written by George R. R. Martin. And furthermore, the entire flashback moved at a snail's pace. It was a relatively long episode. I'm thankful that it was long because the flashback took up way too much screen time, but it was just inert, and it went nowhere, and I was like, oh my god, nowhere has there ever been a better example of what TV writers can do versus what George R. R. Martin can do, because when it got back to the tournament, I was like, game on, this shit fucking rules. But just in case I came across a little harsh in my critique of the flashback sequence, there were two positive ingredients related to the flashback. First and foremost, it gives us context to how Duncan the Tall wins this fight against Aerion Targaryen, because Aerion Targaryen is one of those guys where throughout his entire young life, he's been treated to the best and brightest in all the Seven Kingdoms when it comes to learning how to use the Morning Star, the lance, sword and shield, whatever the case might be. He has been trained by the best. He's competed against the best. He is hell on wheels when it comes to competing in tournaments. But what he probably never did growing up in King's Landing was roll around in the mud fighting people the way that Duncan the Tall did back when he was a little boy running around Flea Bottom, because like they always say in the world of MMA, sooner or later, every fight goes to the ground. And when it does, do you know how to fight on the ground? And in the world of MMA, people fight with chokeholds and arm bars and knee bars and that sort of thing. But in the world of Westeros, fighting in the mud means picking up a shield and beating 7 shades of shit out of somebody until they finally yield. And so that was very satisfying because in the end, Duncan the Tall's been, let's just, to put it kindly, been inadequately trained to compete with a prince of the realm. But when it comes to just being big as shit and strong as shit and rolling around the muck, well then yeah, he's more than ready to throw down. But another positive aspect to the flashback was that we got a brief taste of the aftermath of the first Blackfire Rebellion. Now I don't want to get too lost in the woods going over the history of Westeros, but here's a brief summary of the first Blackfire Rebellion. Known to contemporaries as the Blackfire Rebellion, was a war fought between the loyalist forces of King Daeron II Targaryen and the rebel forces of his half-brother, Daemon I Blackfire. Conflict arose when Daemon, a bastard son of the late King Aegon IV Targaryen, claimed the Iron Throne from Daeron, his older true-born brother, resulting in open civil war that divided the Seven Kingdoms. The conflict was the first of 5 rebellions involving the Blackfire pretenders over 5 generations. But for people who really like to nerd out about Westeros history, go to a wiki of Ice and Fire and look up the subsequent Blackfire rebellions and the role that Dunk and Egg will play in some of those Blackfire rebellions. And I don't know to what degree the second and third season of the show will kind of hint at or suggest some of those things to come, because the novellas involving Dunk and Egg are primarily concerned when the Egg is still just a young squire for Dunk. But I suspect that as the show starts to run out of material, they will definitely tease some of the events that are to come in the future. Which means at some point down the road, we might get a chance to see one of the scenes involving Egg, aka Aegon V, and Bloodraven, one of my favorite characters in all of George R. R. Martin's lore. And as far as the future of Sir Duncan the Tall is concerned, there's some impressive chapters heading our way, as was mentioned in the early part of Season 4 of Game of Thrones.
Sir Duncan the Tall. 4 pages for Sir Duncan. He must have been quite a man.
So they say.
And speaking of teasing future events and future lore, young actor Dexter Sol Ansel is officially a menace, because, well, a lovable menace, because over the last week, a lot of clips have been coming out where he's been accidentally divulging massive spoilers that people have been debating about the fate of Dunk and Egg for fucking decades at this point. And he, in interviews, is just casually spitting things out like, oh, well, George R. R. Martin told us this and blah, blah, blah. And you can see Peter Calaffi absolutely panicking and desperately trying to shut him up. So if you're trying to avoid spoilers related to the show, if you accidentally stumble upon some really interesting casting news as well as some rumors about the final fate of Dunk, well, then you can blame it on Dexter Sol Ansel. But if you want to keep a secret, don't tell a 10-year-old boy because he's going to get excited and start sharing stuff online. But enough procrastinating on my part. Let's get into the juiciest part of the episode, the Trial of Seven. And thankfully, those combat scenes really delivered, as well as the shock ending, which everybody who read the source material has been anticipating for a long time. And everybody's been wondering, how come we're so attached to Baelor Breakspear Targaryen? It's because we barely got to know him before he was taken away from us. Basically, the back half of his skull being removed by his brother Maekar in the middle of combat. And more on that in the next episode. But Baelor is one of those rare Targaryens where he's noble and he's wise and he's patient. He was the hand of the king. He was the heir to the throne. And if he had lived long enough to sit on the Iron Throne, who knows? He might have ushered in a new golden age for the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. But we'll never know. He's a very tragic character, but I think that's why readers have always been so fond of him, is that for a brief shining moment, we get an idea of like what is best in House Targaryen, and then he's snatched away from us, and we're left with characters like Aerion, who's a pretty mean, bloodthirsty, cold-blooded bastard, but at least he got a much-deserved comeuppance at the hands of Duncan the Tall, which I think for a lot of people is going to be a big highlight of the show because it was just so ruthless and so grim. And there were a few interesting little changes from the source material. One of the most interesting was how in the show, Duncan the Tall gets his ass kicked much more in the show than he did in the book. Because in the book, Arion's hitting him with the Morning Star over and over and over again. He's kind of getting banged around and so on and so forth. And he's kind of getting his ass kicked. But in the show, Arion sticks his sword in him quite a few times. But also, Dunk manages to get a licking of his own right in the groin of Arion. I was like, you know what? That didn't happen in the book. But clearly they wanted to give us just a lot more back and forth and a lot more action, as well as the kind of the tease that Dunk, when he goes down, maybe he's not going to get up, because it gives Egg something to do in that final confrontation as he keeps screaming with that high-pitched voice, "Get up!" I wish they'd use that one kind of catchphrase that he uses in all the novellas where he's constantly saying, "Get him! He's right there!" It's one of the, for whatever reason, anytime Dunk's fighting somebody, Egg's always screaming, "He's right there! Like, just get him! He's right there!" But in any case, they wanted to have a little bit more gravitas. But another interesting change was how at the very beginning, when Baelor is kind of telling everybody, like, you know, don't die, so on and so forth, in the book, he has an interesting strategy where he decides that everybody on their side should use tournament lances as opposed to real lances, because tournament lances are wood and much longer, whereas real lances are metal and much shorter, and they're designed to kill people as opposed to exploding on impact. However, with a tournament lance, if you connect first, because they're longer, it's like a foot longer, if you connect well, you might unhorse your opponent, even if your lance explodes, which will give you a massive advantage as you ride around, just smacking them with morning stars or battle axes or swords or whatever the case might be. And I thought it was interesting they decided not to include that when Egg was handing him his lance to go into the Trial of Seven. I thought at that point Baelor was going to interject, but for whatever reason, they decided not to include that little detail in Baelor's strategy. But another ingredient that I really enjoyed is how they more or less depicted the entire Trial of Seven from like the first-person point of view of Sir Duncan the Tall, because during a battle like that, like when you have no peripheral vision, all you're going to see, is Arryn riding towards you with the Morningstar and smashing you in the face, and you're going to be totally unaware of what's happening with all the other combatants out there. And I also like how Baelor totally decides to fight dirty, because the 3 members of the Kingsguard on the other side are not allowed to attack a Prince of the Blood, but he's allowed to attack them all he wants. People are like, oh, is that honorable? He's like, let the gods decide. But that definitely gives him an advantage where you have one person who cannot be touched by half of the opposing side. But I also like seeing just how competent Arryn is on the battlefield. While he might have been a little bit chicken shit not taking on Sir Duncan the Tall in one-on-one, we see that he can more than hold his own on the battlefield. Because if he had turned out just to be an effete, whiny prince who's unable to hold his own, well, that would make Sir Duncan the Tall's victory far less satisfying. But as it stands, it's like, oh my God, Sir Duncan the Tall nearly died like 10 times over. And as they're taking off his armor at the end, they see that all the rings from his ring mail have been punctured into his flesh from the lance that went into him. That also comes straight from the source material. And for whatever reason, Steely Pate is totally ignorant about how you treat a wound like that. He's like, oh, you gotta pour boiling oil in it. And Baelor walks up kind of in a daze. He's like, no, pour boiling wine in it. Otherwise, you'll kill him. Boiling wine will obviously disinfect the wound as they remove all the rings. But it was kind of horrifying seeing just how spaced out Baelor is. And he's talking about how his visor is interfering with his vision, but we can see he doesn't have a visor, and he can't really feel his fingers. And as Steely Pate's examining his helmet in the back, his helmet and his armor are all crushed up together. They get the helmet off, and in the book there's a really nasty description where Sir Duncan the Tall basically sees like a chunk of skull and flesh drop out of the helmet because the entire back of his head is missing, because his brother Maekar, who got a little overzealous in combat, was just swinging his Morningstar all over the fucking place and ended up smacking his brother in the back of the head. But we'll discuss Maekar's reaction to the news that he killed his beloved older brother in the breakdown for next episode. But sadly, it's going to be the last episode, and then we'll probably have to wait 2 more years for another season. But the good news is there are 2 more novellas that they can adapt. We can get 2 more like full-blown seasons, and who knows, because of people had such a positive response to episode 4, maybe they'll make the episodes a little bit longer, like this one, on a more consistent basis. Maybe they'll give them a slightly bigger budget, because if this show is able to maintain and sustain the current level of quality, I have a feeling it might become a lot of people's new favorite show based on the work of George R. R. Martin, because obviously we have House of the Dragon Season 3 right around the corner, and people still have a bad taste in their mouths about how Game of Thrones ended due to the fact that, what the hell are their names? Benioff and Weiss ran out of books to adapt. But at a minimum, we have 1 or 2 more seasons of House of the Dragon to look forward to before the Dance of the Dragon is finished. But also, if they wish to, and if they pull it off, they could easily get 5 or 6 seasons out of the story of Aegon the Conqueror, because the lion's share of Fire and Blood focuses on Aegon the Conqueror and his 2 sisters as they conquer Westeros, and that actually has the most detail. Sadly, because it's written like a history as opposed to a novel, it would give the writers of that show a lot more room to hang themselves. And as we've seen with Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon and now Night of the Seven Kingdoms, anytime writers for television are given rope to hang themselves with, more often than not always, but more often than not, they immediately choke themselves out and like, just stick to the text and you can do no wrong. And I think we're seeing more and more how people who love these books, or any books, are just getting much more defiant about hacks fucking with the material. Like, look at Wuthering Heights, which came out this past weekend. I've never read Wuthering Heights, but for the last 180 years, a lot of people have been reading Wuthering Heights. And when Emerald Fennell released her interpretation of the material, a lot of people were like, this is an abomination, it must be destroyed. And I was like, all right, I'll take your word for it, because I have not yet read it. But I think more often than not these days, if you've got a great book that people love, just use it as like the blueprint, use it as the foundation, and just try not to fuck it up too badly. I feel like the attitude should always be, do no harm. Or if you want to create something original, do something like Spartacus Blood and Sand. I just started watching Spartacus Blood and Sand. I've gotten through the first 12 episodes of season 1, and I'm well aware of what happened to the leading actor. But with Spartacus, they use a few bits of history as a jumping off point, but more or less it's just an excuse to have a lot of gladiatorial combat and orgies. And if what you want to see on the screen is just fights and fucking and palace intrigue, and you've never seen Spartacus Season 1, Blood and Sand, which is available on Netflix, I mean, it's almost a self-parody because it's so violent and so sexual. It's like, oh my God, my virgin eyes, like, what are you doing to me? But anyway, I've been having a blast watching that show. And when you run out of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms to watch, if you're looking for something a little bit like cruder and nastier and a little bit more vulgar, well then Spartacus Blood and Sand very well might fit the bill. But I think that's all I've got to say about this particular episode. I think it's my second favorite episode of the 5 so far, with the fourth being the best by a very healthy margin. But stay tuned later this week. I'm going to do a video about my top 10 favorite fantasy books that might potentially be made into good shows or good movies in the future, assuming that people don't completely vomit all over the material and completely and totally fuck it up. Maybe I'm just asking myself for a cruel and unusual punishment and a lot of misery by even acknowledging that there are a lot of other great books and series out there that could potentially be made into great shows. But I've been having so much fun talking about the fantasy genre on a weekly basis with the Night of the Seven Kingdoms. I can't resist doing yet another video on that topic. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.